It's a new year, 2022, and what better way to start out than with a NASDAQ stock plunge, at least according to the Financial Times yesterday. Jeff, what's today? Today is Thursday, the 7th? Yesterday.
6th.
Yes? Am I right?
The 6th of
good.
January.
2022.
That is the right
So
year.
on Wednesday, there was a big downturn in the NASDAQ, according to the Financial Times. Quote, investors dash out of U.S. stocks in a powerful market rotation. The NASDAQ closed down 3.3% in the worst day since February 2021. I don't know. I thought it would be more dramatic if it was like 1981 or something like that. But here's what happened here. Investors dumped shares in many of the technology companies that surged during the pandemic as the looming specter of higher interest rates prompted them to buy into businesses more tightly linked to the economic recovery. I've got some horrifying numbers here, Jeff. Apple was down 2.7%, Microsoft 3.8%, Google 4.7%, Amazon 1.9%, Tesla, which I had mortgaged lots of money on, 5.4%. So I'm poor, Jeff. And what they continue here in the article here saying, get this, spec tech is getting wrecked, said Hani Reda, a portfolio manager at PineBridge Investments, referring to unprofitable speculative technology companies with high valuations that are being hardest hit. Sounds just like the 1990s, like irrational exuberance, which comes from where, Jeff?
Well, the term or the 90s?
Let's focus on the term. It's the 25th anniversary.
Oh, let's start with the term. Okay. Yes, irrational exuberance was a term invented by Alan Greenspan. I think it was December 5th or 6th of 1996. So 25 years ago last month. There was no anniversary celebration. So I was kind of surprised because people our age sure as hell remember the irrational exuberance speech, young in our careers, our careers stretching before us for far into the future, thinking about nothing but stocks and technology and the new economy, as it was called back then. Yes. And here was Alan Greenspan, the well-respected Federal Reserve chairman, saying, hang on a second, people, let's take a look at what's really going on here. And the thing about irrational exuberance and that particular speech was it wasn't really about the stock market. But yet everybody back in 1996, that's all they heard, because even by then there was already this kind of nagging feeling that stocks were doing something they maybe shouldn't be doing. Maybe we were getting into asset bubble territory and it was kind of new, didn't really know much to make about it. It was in one sense pretty kind of interesting that most people sort of focused in on the stock angle rather than listening to what the guy actually said, which of course would become a common theme throughout the rest of the 1990s. When Alan Greenspan, more than maybe anybody else in economics or central banking, was actually spilling the beans at the time. And he was actually being honest about what was really going on, because at that time he thought, well, it wouldn't make a difference.
You make that point in your article, which is titled, We Would Do Well to Heed Alan Greenspan's Words from 1996. That was posted at Real Clear Markets on the 17th of December. And you make that point that Greenspan is infamously known for giving non-answers. It was only the other big figure in Washington during that time, President Bill Clinton, who could match him word for word in giving non-answers. And what is the definition of is? Here he was, as you said, more straightforward, unusual candor, straightforward language, nothing like the Fed speak he would later become infamous for. Oh, man. So you did use infamous. I guess I thought I was coming up with.
Well, it was infamous. So we both have to use that term. It was an infamous speech and it was an infamous term and it was an infamous time.
Here, and you tell us it wasn't about the stock market so much. It was about something else. I'm going to read a quote and then we can go from there. Okay, so here's from his speech. At different times in our history, a varying set of simple indicators seemed successfully to summarize the state of monetary policy and its relationship to the economy. Thus, during the decades of the 1970s and 1980s, trends in money supply, first M1, then M2, were useful guides. We could convey the thrust of our policy with money supply targets. though we felt free to deviate from those targets for good reason. Unfortunately, money supply trends veered off path several years ago. We're going to have to ask him how much did he stretch that several? Wow, that's much further, bigger stretch of several than I understand it to be. Anyways, here we go. Several years ago, as a useful summary of the overall economy, thus to keep Congress informed on what we are doing, we have been required to explain the full complexity of the substance of our deliberations and how we see economic relationships and evolving trends. What does that have to do with the NASDAQ?
It doesn't really. And what he's really saying is what we've been saying on the show all along. And here's Alan Greenspan admitting the Federal Reserve is not in the money business. The Federal Reserve doesn't do money. As he said in the second part of that quote you just read, Emil, what Alan Greenspan is saying is that since we don't really know anything about the monetary system, we can't really have a good handle on it. What we have to do instead is kind of look at a bunch of economic numbers and try to gauge whether or not our monetary policy is actually having the intended effect. So we look at the inflation rate, we look at the unemployment rate, we look at GDP, we look at all these other numbers. What we don't look at is money. We don't use M1 and M2. And you're right, he stretched that term several years ago because he conflated M1 and M2 on purpose, knowing full well that M1 was obsolete 25 years before he even said those words. And M2 was probably mostly obsolete and unhelpful in the early 1980s, if not the late 1970s. But as he was speaking technically, it really didn't veer off path so dramatically until the late 1980s. So that's his several years ago. He's using M1 and M2 together and saying, well, we finally gave up on both M1 and M2 around the late 80s because it was obvious they were no longer useful. Now, where this comes into the stock market should be obvious and apparent to everybody because everybody believes in the stock bubbles are a monetary affair, right? If somebody's printing money, it goes into the stock market. And so what Alan Greenspan is saying in 1996 was, how the hell would we even know? We can't keep track of the monetary system, so we don't know if stocks are behaving rationally or irrationally. We have no way of saying or no way of determining the monetary aspect of what's going on in the stock market. But that's not really about the stock market, is it? It's about the entire global economy. What he's saying is, yeah, we can't keep track of money for stocks, but by implication and by insinuation, we also can't keep track of money for the real economy, the real global economy either. And that's the point that he was making, is that we're not a central bank. He's saying in 1996, his most famous irrational exuberance speech, we don't do money. We can't do money. We don't even know how to do money. But all anybody heard was irrational exuberance, stockbubble.com, all that stuff. And they missed the big point. They missed the boat, which was this other massive thing that would come back to bite us all in August of 2007.
The mainstream media, the financial press miss a point. And it's such a big quote. Unfortunately, money supply trends veered off path several years ago. That should have been the leading headline. Okay, so Jeff, if I understand this correctly, we're worried about the denominator, right? Because the stocks were denominated in dollars, and maybe nominally they should be rising. And we've seen recent examples of that in Venezuela. The Venezuelan stock market was rip-roaring because there were so many more bolivars. And we see the same thing, I believe, in Turkey right now. As the currency is depreciating, the stock market is gaining value nominally, right? And so is that what he was saying? He was saying, aha, we don't know if it's irrational exuberance because maybe there's a lot more money, and therefore the denominator would suggest that the nominal value of stocks should be rising. But he also raised the point of M2. He said, we don't know about M2. And in your article, you give an example that Mr. Greenspan would maybe rely on and say, hey, we have an example of just a few years ago where M2 went haywire. So why should we rely on M2? And that was about Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. What happened with M2 during that time period?
Well, it wasn't really M2 so much as it was the S&L crisis. The S&L crisis was essentially the reason why M2 veered off path, but the economy never did. And that's kind of what we're really talking about here, is that we're focusing on M1 and M2 as we're taught to do. Even today, we're taught that, hey, when you think about money, think about M1 and M2, or mostly M2. M3 is discontinued for reasons that actually have to do with what we're talking about. But it isn't that M2 veered off path and we fell into a depression like the 1920s, because M2 actually suddenly around 1988, 1989 stopped growing at the same rate it had throughout the rest of the 1980s. So we didn't experience a deflationary, depressionary monetary shock in the late 1980s, even though M2 veered off path severely. So what was really happening is that the same thing with M1 in the 1970s, the banking system, the monetary system globally, had started using other forms of money. So when the M2 form of money started to do something different, the other forms of money that we don't account for made up for that shortfall, which is why the global economy didn't fall into Great Depression 2 in 1989 and 1990. So what Greenspan was really saying, if you boil it down into its real cases, is he wasn't saying that, hey, he wasn't just saying that M2 veered off path. What he was saying is M2 is really kind of obsolete. It doesn't capture the entire monetary realm that's out there. It's only a minor and at that time, decreasing subset of the global monetary system, focused entirely, M2 is, on the depository parts of the monetary system, which is why it would make sense with the S&L crisis, as S&L's depository institutions were subjected to that really serious retrenchment in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The depository form of money would also suffer too. But again, the overall point is, the economy didn't fall into depression because there were other forms of money in the real economy that were making up for this deficit. So there was money out there. It's just that the Fed, nor economists, nor anybody else around the world had any idea what it was or how much it was, because we focused on M2 and nobody said, well, M2's falling off. Let's develop a realistic M3 or M4 or L or something else. They just basically said, this is too complicated. There's more money out there, and we're really at a loss here.
So tell me if I have this correctly. So for a number of years, M2 was growing at a certain rate, money was expanding, and the economy was expanding, and there was some correlation between the two. Then towards the late 80s, all of a sudden we had M2 slow down while the economy kept pace. And because we back into velocity, it was assumed that velocity was surging through the roof, right? And so that would suggest, wait a minute, why are people using money so much more rapidly? And that Greenspan was saying, hey, there's something wrong with this measure, as you've just explained. So do I have that right? If M2 had fallen, the rate of growth, we should fall into some sort of recession or depression. That didn't happen because we were using M3, M4, M5.
Yes, velocity is supposed to be relatively stable. There's, minor kinks and quirks and fluctuations as we go, but velocity overall, and again, we're using the equation of exchange, which isn't really an equation. It's sort of a backwards engineered process, which velocity is a remainder of the term. So essentially, velocity is supposed to be stable. And you're right, Emil, what happened in the late 1980s is that M2 stopped growing. It actually ground to a halt almost. Growth came to almost zero, which really should have produced a massive deflationary shock in the US economy if it was all representative. But the economy kept going as if nothing had happened, which meant by, a simple arithmetic, V had to go way up. Now, V didn't actually go way up in any real sense. It was just a mathematical remainder, because M2 was not the appropriate money supply indicator to plug into the equation of exchange. And so not just in the late 1980s, we saw the same thing happen in the 1970s with M1. If you're trying to plug in the equation of exchange and you see velocity go do something crazy, that's not a sign that velocity has gone crazy. That's a sign that you're using the wrong M. And so what Greenspan was saying, irrational exuberance, was we're using the wrong M. The economy is using other monetary forms that we don't really have a good handle on. So therefore, we really don't know. We can't use the monetary system to gauge whether or not we're actually being successful. So we have to do this workaround where we look at inflation, we look at the Phillips curve, we do all these econometric models to see whether or not this non-money monetary policy is actually producing fruitful results. Because we don't do money. That's really the message here. The monetary system evolved through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it really never stopped in the 90s either. And if central banks stopped being central banks and started being something else entirely.
Now, earlier I had what apparently is a big non sequitur. I just mentioned Saddam Hussein, and people are wondering, is Emil crazy? Jeff didn't even answer. He was just being nice to Emil and hoping that we Don't mention it. He's crazy. He's talking about Saddam Hussein. Jeff, is there any way to save my reputation? Is there any link to the invasion of Kuwait and the most recent activity we see in bond markets as we bring the story to the present?
Yeah, the interesting part about Saddam Hussein is he does play a role here, and it was a role Alan Greenspan knew only too well. Is if you remember, if you were around in August of 1990, Iraq suddenly, surprisingly, shockingly invaded Kuwait. And one of the immediate products of that was a spike in oil prices. In fact, it looked like the oil market knew it was coming before CNN did, and probably before the CIA and intelligence agencies too, because you saw oil prices, which were relatively low through the first part of 1990. All of a sudden, they more than doubled through the invasion and the early part of what became the Gulf War crisis up until around October, November of 1990. And that doubling of oil prices had the effect of same thing that happens throughout history when oil prices suddenly rise rapidly. We were in recession. And so, a lot of people maybe remember the Gulf War, but maybe don't remember the timing or the relationship with the 1990 recession. And to be clear, we're not saying that the oil price shock caused the recession. More likely, that was the S&L crisis that caused the recession. But the oil shock made the recession that much worse and that much more likely that it was going to be a full-blown contraction.
You're not alone in that opinion. The National Bureau of Economic Research that dates American recessions said the recession began in July 1990, a month before the invasion. So S&L crisis and then the oil price shock didn't help. How do we tie it all back to the present, Jeff? You raised the subject of the 5-year TIPS auction in October of last year. What does that have to do with irrational exuberance, money supply, oil?
Well, I think most people are aware, if not just from what they pay for gasoline at the pump, just paying attention to recent CPIs, as we've talked about, the heavy dose of gasoline involved in those. We are experiencing what kind of looks like an oil price shock too. And what happened on October 21st was a 5-year TIPS auction where the 5-year, as we've said before on this show, the 5-year TIPS auction has a tendency to reset the inflation break-evens in the TIPS market, which is exactly what happened. And in that point, at that time, the inflation break-evens leapt up, 17 base, some enormous amount in a single day, which ever since then, at least up until recently, the bond yields throughout the rest of the world had started to sink and growth prospects started to decline, which had all the hallmarks and telltale signs of an oil price shock macroeconomic case, sort of like early 1990. And where M2 and Alan Greenspan and irrational exuberance fits into all this is because we can't use M2, we can't use the traditional money supply definitions to say that this is inflationary, because we don't have the inflationary, we at least using M2 and M1 or any of the traditional definitions of money supply, we don't have them available to say, hey, yes, this is going to be an inflationary case, not a deflationary oil supply shock case. What we're really saying is irrational exuberance. You have to look deeper about what's going on in the monetary system than just those monetary aggregates. And when oil prices go up sharply, that's usually not a good thing for either the inflation case or the economy.
Jeff, that's it for me from this episode, this article, ladies and gentlemen. You can read it again at Real Clear Markets. It was posted on the 17th of December. We would do well to heed Alan Greenspan's words from 1996. Any concluding thoughts that we didn't raise during the show?
No, yeah, we should heed his words from 1996 to 2000. It was in that 5-year period where Greenspan rather frequently kept returning to this theme, which was, we don't do money. And it's really something I think we need to, more people need to be aware of. I was asked recently on a radio episode for WOR in New York, why should we listen to you talk about this, this Eurodollar system, this offshore shadow money system? And what I tell people is you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to these people. Alan Greenspan, 25 years ago, telling you in no uncertain terms, unusual candor, we're not a central bank. We don't do money. We don't even know how to. You don't have to take my word for it. And the implications of all this are the last 50 years, but particularly the last 15 years of not just economic and financial history, but social and political and, civilization's history.
All right, Jeff, in part 2 of this episode, we're going to talk about a strange phenomenon where wages are increasing rapidly, and that seems great. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's a sign of a deflationary potential. How can that be? We're going to go back to the 1930s for answers.